What I want to do now is I want to cover briefly the new diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5 for uh, alcohol use disorder. Now, the criteria are the same for cocaine use disorder or marijuana use disorder. They're simply changed a little bit to reflect the language of the drug that's being used. I'm going to really, for simplicity, focus on the alcohol use disorder in the DSM-5. And again, the word addiction is not present. A distinction between alcohol abuse and alcohol dependency, like that which was made in the DSM-4, no longer exists. It is simply called a substance use disorder. In this case, or the example that I'm going to look at, an alcohol use disorder. And let's talk for a moment about the prevalence. This is actually one of the most common diagnoses that's made. The DSM-5 tells us that about 5% of teenagers actually meet the diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder. About 12% of adult men, in my mind, that's a phenomenally high number, and about 5% of adult women meet the diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder. So those are the statistics as to how many people or what the prevalence is in our population. Let's talk about the criteria. Now, those of you who are familiar with the DSM-3 and with the DSM-4 and, of course, the DSM-4 TR, you're familiar with what in the DSM-3R was described as 9 criteria for the diagnosis of addiction. The DSM-4 used 7 criteria, but there were 2 that were and or. So it was still the magic number of 9. The choices that were given in the DSM-5 are actually more expansive, and we've moved to a series of 13 different things. It's actually 11, but 10 is A, 10A or 10B, 11 is 11A or 11B, so really it ends up being 13 indicators in the code. So what I've done here is I've listed them out: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And this is actually 11 and 12 and 11 and 13. So there are a few more things that have been added in the DSM-5 for us to take a look at. Now, over here, what we're looking for really are patterns of use. And so in the category of patterns of use, the first thing I'm looking for is there an increase in the use? Does the person use more today than they did before? This is one of those things that can potentially indicate a substance use disorder. In other words, they used to only drink a beer a week, and now they're drinking a beer a day. They used to only drink a beer a day after work when they were eating dinner, and now they're drinking a 12-pack of beer a day. Okay, so is there an increase in use? My stepfather, I mentioned my father who died of alcoholism. My stepfather is not an alcoholic. My stepfather now is, I think he's about 89 years old, and for as long as I've known him, and I've known him for over 30 years, I think 35 years, my stepfather, his entire drinking pattern, the only time I've ever seen him drink is after he cuts the lawn in the summertime. And so after he cuts the lawn in the summertime, he goes out and mows the yard. He'll come in and he'll say to my mother, would you like to split a beer, babe? And my mom will say, sure. And my mom, I don't think, actually usually drinks her beer, but she splits a beer with him. And he pours 1 beer into 2 juice glasses, and then he has half a beer after he's cut the yard. I've actually never seen him drink at any other time ever, unless it's summertime and he's cutting the yard, and then he has half a beer after he cuts the lawn. A 6-pack of beer lasts my stepfather 6 weeks, because you only cut the yard once a week. This has never changed for as long as I have known him. And so there's been no increase in use. That's how we know, or one of the ways we know, that Toby, my stepfather, is not an alcoholic. The second thing we're looking for under pattern of use is, have they done things to attempt to control their use? For example, have they hid liquor from themselves, or hid money, or made alcohol or drugs somehow inaccessible to them? Have they, turned themselves in to their parents or, their spouse so that somebody else can take responsibility for them and monitor them? In other words, is there an attempt to control the use? My grandfather was one who attempted to control his use. To prove that he wasn't an alcoholic, every single January he quit drinking for a month to prove that he wasn't an alcoholic. That is an attempt to control use. It's also an indicator of the potential for a substance use disorder. The third thing we're looking for under pattern is there an increased amount of time spent in the pursuit of and or the use of alcohol or mood-altering substances? My stepfather, he spends about 15 minutes drinking half a beer once a week during the summer. That's the only time he ever spends in pursuit of or using alcohol in any form. At least as far as I've known for the last 35 years, there's not an increase in time. He's not now spending 4 hours a night down at the bowling alley or at the local tavern drinking alcohol. So one of the things we're looking for in their pattern of use, are they spending more time engaged in either the pursuit of or the use of mood-altering substances? Now, alcoholics can spend a tremendous amount of time at the neighborhood bar or at home simply drinking. The effects of alcohol actually last several hours. They linger. When we talk about cocaine addiction, the effect, the high from cocaine, especially crack cocaine, smoked cocaine, can be very, very short. The high can last 15, 20, 30 minutes, maybe at the most for some of our clients when they're using cocaine. So what we see is an increase in the quantity of time in the pursuit of the drugs. And they can spend hours trying to get the best deal or weigh the drugs or make their connections. And it's almost as if the action of doing so becomes the distraction and is really the first high for them in this process. So we're looking for any of these patterns that might be present according to the DSM-5. Then what we're looking for is we're looking at symptoms that are related to problems that a person might experience. And the first is, are they beginning to fail at the important tasks of life? Getting to work, getting kids to school, paying their bills, doing the tasks of life. Is there a failure? Is there a breakdown in what should be the easily accomplished tasks of everyday living? And we begin to see an interruption into daily life patterns as a result of drug or alcohol use. Again, one more of the criteria for substance use disorder is met. Then what we see, we're looking for, related to problems, is continued use despite patterns and obligations not being met. Patterns of failure and obligations not being met. Do they continue to use? There are many people out there who, because of their alcohol or drug use, have failed to accomplish what they needed to. And when they recognized they were failing at what they needed to accomplish, they quit drinking or they quit drugging. But one of the indicators of alcoholism is, do they continue to use in the face of these failures? The next thing we're looking for in the problems associated with drug and alcohol use, do they begin to withdraw from life? You see, if I withdraw from life, I can't fail at life. So if I quit my job, I can't miss my shift. If I quit my school, I can't get an F. Do they begin to withdraw from life? If I break up with my girlfriend, she won't complain that I'm an alcoholic anymore because I'm alone. And so do we begin to see patterns in their life where they begin to withdraw from life itself? The fourth thing that we're looking for in this category here is, do they continue to use alcohol despite being in hazardous situations? In other words, there are a number of different examples here I could give. Obviously, driving a car while intoxicated. I know I need to drive, but I continue to use despite the fact that I'm going to be driving. This, of course, is hazardous to the person who's drinking, as well as to other people on the road, and certainly a legal problem as well. So that would be the obvious example. Other examples, though, is do they have problems as a result of their drinking, continue to use, and put themselves in hazardous situations? For example, 15, 20 years ago, drunk on a plane got you kicked off the plane. Drunk on a plane today might very well land you in the jail. There's a a decreased tolerance on the part of flight attendants for not following the directions that are given. And this is actually a federal crime. And the newspaper seems to be filled with stories of people who are putting themselves in legal jeopardy because they continue to use, despite the knowledge that that they have social problems and failures as a result of their drug use. And then the fifth thing that we're looking for, the fifth indicator, is do they continue to use despite the knowledge that consequences are sure to be experienced? In other words, do they continue to use despite the knowledge that their liver is failing and they're going to die of cirrhosis? Do they continue to use despite the knowledge that if they relapse, their probation is going to be revoked? Do they continue to use despite the knowledge that their spouse is going to leave them if they continue to use? And so do they continue to use despite knowledge of important and tragic consequences for the behavior that they've chosen? I do a lot of bariatric counseling. Bariatric counseling is the area of counseling where we're addressing obesity and the need for weight loss. In fact, a lot of the clients, if I'm not treating chemical dependency, I'm usually treating obesity. And I sort of specialize in working with these guys. They're 50 years old, they're 400 pounds, and they've been ruled out as a candidate for surgery. And if they don't lose half their body weight in the next 24 months, they're going to die. And this is another area of clients who I have a great deal of compassion towards and who I really enjoy working with. But when I'm working with my bariatric clients, they really struggle with the issue of what is called toxic hunger, that craving that is insatiable and they must eat now, no matter what it is or how unhealthy it is. Well, one of the things we see here in addiction or in substance use disorder diagnosis is we see physical symptoms of the substance use disorder. And the first one on the list here in the DSM-5 is actually a craving for the drug or the alcohol, or the analogy I compare it to is that toxic hunger of my obese clients. This isn't simply, I'd like to have a beer, or man, it's hot out and a cold drink sure would feel great, or sure would taste great. This is that insatiable appetite. This is that emotional as well as physical craving that a person experiences, knowing that they're going to find no peace until they satisfy that craving. Now, you and I know that peace is short-lived. It's a false peace, but they believe that just one will do it. And of course, the old saying in chemical dependency counseling, one is too many and 1,000 is not enough. And that's the craving or the toxic hunger that the DSM-5 talks about. Now, criteria number 10 in the DSM-5 is actually related to tolerance. Is there an increase in tolerance? And this is one of the early signs of substance use disorder. Or is there a decrease in tolerance? And that's really one of the signs of late stage addiction. Now, by the way, when we're measuring these things, we're looking for the last 12 months. So if we have somebody who's been drinking, for many years, they've probably gone way past the increase in tolerance phase. Now they're in the decrease in tolerance phase. If it's somebody who has a fast progression with the drug of choice, we may actually catch them here in the early stage. But what we're measuring for is these are all questions that we're going to ask about the last 12 months. The diagnostic criteria focuses on the last 12 months because what we're looking for are recent symptoms that they've experienced so that we can make a diagnosis of substance use disorder here in the present. Criteria number 11 is actually 11A or 11B. So all in all, there's actually 13, even though it's expressed numerically as 11 criteria. And that is, do they have withdrawal syndrome? That's criteria 11A. Do they have withdrawal syndrome? When they don't put drugs or alcohol in their body, they begin to have withdrawal symptoms or withdrawal syndrome. There is in the DSM-5 specific criteria for the diagnosis of withdrawal syndrome. These include shakes. The Big Book of AA calls it restlessness, irritability, discontrol. It could be hallucinations, just a number of different symptoms. And when we go into the assessment process later on in our training, I'll enumerate those things. Sometimes our clients never experience withdrawal symptoms, though, or syndrome. And the reason why is because criteria 11B. They've been engaging in behavior that is their attempt to avoid withdrawal. So, for example, if I have Bloody Marys in the morning, I avoid withdrawal, don't I? Because I re-intoxicate myself. Or what we see, the case of Dr. Bob, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. He was a proctologist. He was a physician, of course. And he knew in Dr. Bob's story that he was not an alcoholic because he never drank during the day. But he was taking sedative hypnotics, pills, during the daytime in order to avoid the withdrawal symptoms because of the absence of alcohol. So what we're looking for in criteria 11, we're looking for either the presence of withdrawal symptoms or we're looking for behavioral attempts or substitutionary behaviors that are the client's attempts to avoid withdrawal. Now, the DSM-5 is different from the DSM-4 and the previous versions. The previous versions gave us a category for alcohol abuse or a category for alcohol dependency. That's been dropped by the DSM-5, and what we have instead is we have three categories, either mild, moderate, or severe indicators. So substance use disorder is diagnosed in the DSM-5 in the category of mild, when a client of these 11 symptoms is manifesting 2 to 3 of them. So if our client says, yes, I've had an increase in use, yes, I've been driving my car drunk, and yes, I have this insatiable craving. Well, that's 3 of them. That would be mild severity index of substance use disorder, 2 or 3 of these things. If my client were to go on and say, I've also had this and I've also had this, 4 to 5 is an indicator of, according to the DSM-5, moderate substance use disorder. And then if our client says yes to 6 or more of these, then in the last 12 months, then the DSM-5 gives it the indicator of a severe substance use disorder. Now, because we know about the progression of addiction, I've already talked about that progression, Dr. Jelinek's chart, a chronic, progressive, incurable condition characterized by loss of control over drugs, alcohol, and other mood-altering substances. So even though the DSM-5 uses the indicator mild, moderate, and severe, those are 3 words I never would have chosen. I think they're lousy word choices on the part of the DSM-5 because it gives the indicator, well, I have a mild substance use disorder. This is really no big deal. I got a moderate substance use disorder, so it's really no big deal. I don't like these word choices, and words have meaning. Because the reality is if my client says yes to 2 or 3 of these today, come back 6 months from now. I bet you say yes to 4 of these or 5 of these things. And if my client says yes to 4 or 5 of these things today, left unchecked, left untreated, without intervention, they'll say yes to 6 of these, or 7 of these, or 8 of these, or 9 of these, or all 11 of these 6 months from now. Mild, moderate, severe, they're not the words that I would have used. But those are the words of the DSM-4. But we need to recognize that all substance use disorder is substance use disorder, which brings me back to what I think the simplest diagnostic tool is. There was a very well-known chemical dependency counselor who was a Roman Catholic priest named Father Martin. And anybody who's watching this who's done addiction counseling for any period of time has come across the literature or the old movies that that Father Martin made about alcoholism. He was one of those people who was a friend of Alcoholics Anonymous early on in its founding and was really a supporter throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And Father Martin, in one of the probably the earliest educational movies made on the subject of alcoholism, simply said this: anything that causes a problem is a problem. And even though the DSM-5 gives us a fancy set of diagnostic indicators and severity indexes to measure these things from, I actually still tend to favor Father Martin's definition of alcoholism. And that simply was, anything that causes my client a problem is a problem.